Welcome to this explainer, Asia's geopolitical tectonic plates, and how unresolved borders are shaping global security. When we think of global conflict, we usually look right to the center of the stage. But the future of international security, it isn't being decided there. It's actually being decided on the edges of the map. So today, we're embarking on a geopolitical tour to understand how these unresolved borders in Asia are quietly dictating the future of our world. So let's dive right into this by asking a pretty critical question. Where will the next major global conflict begin? While everyone's attention is understandably locked on today's active wars and the daily headlines, the true flashpoints, the ones that could literally rewrite the international order, are quietly simmering along unresolved borders and disputed waters. These are the hidden fault lines where major powers collide. To navigate all of this, here is our flight path for today. 1. Geopolitical fault lines. 2. The Kuril Islands dispute. 3. India and China's border. 4. The Taiwan Strait dilemma. And finally 5. Global stakes and future. Part 1. Geopolitical fault lines. To really understand these regions, we have to view them as grinding geopolitical tectonic plates. When they shift, the whole world feels the tremors. Which brings us to Part 2. The Kuril Islands dispute. Our first stop takes us to the freezing waters of the North Pacific, looking at the 56 volcanic islands that make up the Kuril chain, stretching right between Japan's Hokkaido Island and Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. Now, this dispute is basically a diplomatic tug-of-war dating back over a century. Boundaries here were formally established way back in 1855, then they shifted again in 1875 as empires negotiated their reach, but this timeline effectively froze right at the end of World War II. Despite the 1945 Yalta Agreement and a 1956 joint declaration that were supposed to normalize relations, we've had an unresolved standoff paralyzing the region ever since. The sheer length of this history means generation after generation has grown up with this territorial ambiguity just hanging over their heads. And because of that deep history, these two nations are completely locked in a stalemate, entirely unable to sign a permanent peace treaty to this very day. Japan adamantly demands the return of the 4 southernmost islands, viewing them as stolen land that was illegally occupied in the closing days of the war. Russia, on the other hand, they claim these exact same islands as the lawful spoils of war, firmly backed by their interpretation of post-war agreements and international precedent. So you have both sides operating with entirely incompatible historical narratives. And look, this isn't just a high-level government dispute. It is deeply personal to the everyday citizens involved. An overwhelming 78% of Russians actually oppose returning the islands to Japan. Relinquishing control is viewed as surrendering a piece of Russia's hard-won post-war national identity. That makes any sort of compromise politically toxic for leadership in Moscow. These islands have transcended mere territory. They're a powerful symbol of national pride and endurance. Ultimately, neither side is willing to budge because the tangible stakes are absolutely massive. For Russia, these islands provide a vital natural fortress. They offer deep-water stealth routes, which allows the Pacific Fleet submarines to just slip out of the Sea of Okhotsk and into the open ocean entirely undetected. Combine that immense strategic advantage with abundant fisheries and untapped mineral resources, and it becomes remarkably clear why Russia has rapidly militarized the chain since 2015. They've been incredibly busy, building new barracks, deploying missile systems, and constructing airstrips uncomfortably close to Japan's northern shores. Moving on to Part 3, India and China's border. Let's pivot to the high-altitude friction along the line of actual control between India and China. 2 massive powers sharing a long, highly contested boundary right in the Himalayas. Ever since the violent clashes across 7 border points back in 2020, the Himalayas have been an absolute powder keg. Those initial skirmishes completely shattered decades of carefully managed border protocols. But recently, we've actually seen a rapid succession of diplomatic maneuvers. October brought a sudden agreement on troop disengagement at the last 2 major standoff points. That was quickly followed by a face-to-face meeting between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the BRICS summit. And by December, high-level talks were taking place. On the surface, this flurry of diplomacy looks like a definitive breakthrough, right? Well, actually, we need to read between the lines here. As our sources point out, these recent agreements absolutely do not mean India-China relations are suddenly back to normal. The underlying geopolitical friction between these 2 demographic giants remains incredibly fragile. We're talking about 2 nations simultaneously competing for water access, vital resources, and broad regional dominance.
Both countries continue to aggressively build dual-use infrastructure, roads, and military installations right up to the border. So sure, the frontline troops might have stepped back a few paces, but the grand strategic rivalry, that absolutely has not.
This brings us to part 4, the Taiwan Strait dilemma. This is our final and perhaps most high-stakes stop, where Beijing has officially elevated the reunification of Taiwan to a primary, uncompromising national goal. Beijing's desire for reunification is definitely not just political rhetoric. It is backed by a massive, rapidly modernizing military apparatus that constantly postures around the island. We're talking regular deployments of naval vessels and fighter jets crossing median lines, significantly increasing the threat intensity and the frequency of military drills in the Strait. These ongoing gray zone tactics serve as a daily, visible reminder of the immense hard power positioned just miles away from Taiwan's shores. Now, the pivotal number you really need to keep in mind here is 2027. This specific year has been flagged by analysts and security sources as a critical potential deadline for Xi Jinping's strategic pursuits. Why? Well, the year aligns with the centennial of the People's Liberation Army and is heavily tied to a mandate to secure his personal legacy, finalizing what Beijing views as the great and necessary rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It creates this shrinking timeline that puts immense pressure on all the global actors involved. But executing this strategy, it's like a giant puzzle with a multi-layered dilemma. Internally, there is a massive ideological divide. The younger generation in Taiwan fiercely identifies with democratic values, creating a distinct civic identity that outright rejects reunification. Then, externally, Beijing faces intense restraints. A conflict would mean shedding the blood of those they consider Chinese brethren, which carries a deep cultural stigma. On top of that, it risks shattering incredibly deep cross-strait economic bonds. We're talking billions in Taiwanese investments that currently drive a huge chunk of China's coastal economy. And then there is the sheer scale of external deterrence. 1.1 billion. That's 1.1 billion US dollars in recent defense support funneled directly to Taiwan. This staggering security investment acts as a powerful counterweight, making a full-scale invasion highly unpragmatic. It transforms any potential military action into an incredibly risky endeavor, one that could trigger devastating international sanctions, disrupt global semiconductor supply chains, and cause catastrophic domestic economic fallout for Beijing.
Which leads us to part 5, global stakes and future. Zooming back out, we can clearly see why grasping the granular details of these 3 locations is absolutely vital. What happens at these borders doesn't just stay at these borders.
So I'll leave you with this. As these unresolved borders continue to experience intense friction, which of these fault lines will ultimately shape our global future? Will the years ahead bring a peaceful resolution, or are we looking at a devastating fracture?